Oh, welcome to another episode of The Grove. Shout out to our partners, Craze and Friends, for making this happen. And Clean Tech Growth Lab, if you're looking to grow in clean tech, you do it with them. But without them, it would not be possible to interview awesome people doing awesome things like Celine. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I I don't even think I'm not even going to add any type of introduction. I am super excited to talk about what you're building, how you're building it. Um, but before we do that, I would just like you to give a brief introduction of yourself and what you're
Sure.
building.
So I was born and raised right outside of Philadelphia, still there. Two older sisters, two wonderful parents, and I went to Fairfield University in my undergrad and studied business analytics and biology. So my background's super nerdy. I did climate change research for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Always have had an affinity for science. I thought I wanted to be in the lab and in the field, and I actually had the chance to present that research to policymakers in Oregon and Washington, and it was dismissed pretty quickly. And so I realized that if I wanted to have an outsized sort of impact on the planet, it wasn't going to be, unfortunately, in the science realm. And so I switched onto the business side of things. I worked at Greenbacker Capital, which is a private equity firm that invests in renewable infrastructure and sustainable assets, which is essentially just solar and wind. And so I was doing a lot of power purchasing agreements. And then I got started founding GreenIRR about 3 years ago today and have been working hard on it ever since.
So then let's focus on before we get into the story of how you built Greener and what it's been like to develop the product and explore the market and stuff like that. I want to understand what it was like for you at that time, leaving leaving a job that provided more security, maybe, a lifestyle that was more secure. What was the decision to jump into entrepreneurship? Had you, I mean, you gave a little bit of background, but did you have familiarity with entrepreneurship at the time?
That's such a good question. So I was introduced to entrepreneurship through Fairfield's startup program, which is essentially a 9-month accelerator for undergrad, where you come up with an idea, you work on it for 9 months, and then you pitch it to investors. And so at the beginning, when there was a lot of ideation going on, I didn't exactly know what Greener was going to be, but I really liked the idea of accountability and transparency. And once the idea started to take shape, I felt like I didn't have a choice but to pursue it. So it was like this very sort of divine and like blissful feeling of, wow, I found something that feels so true. And I felt super called to pursue it. And it was just like this massive adrenaline rush for months and months to pull that idea out of my head and make it tangible. And so that was my introduction. Well, I should say that was the genesis of the idea and what it felt like. And then through the Fairfield Startup Program, I was able to follow more of an academic curriculum on, what does a competitive landscape look like, how to do a market sizing, what's channel distribution, sort of the elements of a standard business model that anyone would need to know, which was particularly helpful for me because I was coming from the science world, so I knew absolutely nothing about business at the time. Went through the program and then couldn't shake the feeling of needing to continue to pursue the idea. It was all I wanted to spend my time doing. And so I stuck with it. And I remember distinctly what you're talking about, that decision of, am I going to follow the traditional, I have my major, there's predefined steps and, pretty predefined path for me if I wanted to go into finance, if I wanted to go into some sort of analytical or comp sci role. I knew exactly how I was going to get there. And I feel like the fear of doing something uncertain is a pretty terrifying feeling. And over time, learned that uncertainty can be a superpower. And I knew just through pure excitement about, how big this idea could be, where I wanted to end up, and sort of had to let go of how I was going to get there, which I think is a really good practice. If you can sort of force yourself into leaning into uncertainty, you'll always be surprised by where you end up, or I should say, how you get there. And so, for me, it felt like I didn't have a choice. I needed to pursue the idea, but I do remember turning down a few job offers, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But my family is incredibly supportive. My
Mm.
friends are supportive. I had established relationships with people that taught me how to believe in myself and bet on myself. And so that decision was a little bit easier for me because I had enough people in my corner to encourage it.
So with that context, when you were working with the private equity firm, was that still during school or was that post school?
That was still an undergrad.
So what was your what perspective did you gain? What did you learn from working in private equity that either pulled you towards the industry or pushed you away from it?
I think a few things from a what valuable lessons did I learn? It was my first real experience inside corporate America, which when I look at who we're selling into today, it's important to understand how organizations work, how decisions work, who's responsible for what. And so I remember being super impressionable at that time and just understanding how different teams cross-functionally interacted was really relevant. I would say today more so than when I was ideating. That was amazing. And then I think what pushed me away from it was on a personal level, every day felt predictable, which sounds a little crazy to say, but I woke up every day knowing exactly what I was going to do from 9 to 5, which is great for some people. But I didn't feel like in the near future, I was going to be put in a position where I could be making decisions of consequence, which is the type of ownership that I wanted to have, not just professionally, but in my life. And I didn't necessarily feel challenged in a way that required me to have any sort of original thought where I wasn't able to think creatively or strategically in a way that impacted the overall business. It was more so heads down work, and the mission of the company was amazing, but my contribution to that mission felt a little bit small.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally feel like that can be found in other areas or corners of corporate America, but for me, that sort of pushed me away, and my ultimate goal was to have an outsized impact. And seeing the speed at which certain organizations were moving versus, the almost urgent or critical timeline that we need to be acting when it comes to climate change didn't feel fast enough. And I felt like I could take control and ownership over my impact by taking things into my own hands.
So there was something that you had said in that answer, which is decisions of consequence. Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
So for me, and I'm probably going to insult some people when I say this, but as an anecdote or as an analogy, if you're in consulting, you're doing a bunch of research to inform other people of how to run their organization, what decisions should be made in order to make the organization more efficient, more effective, more profitable, but you don't ever have to personally deal with the emotional consequence of a decision that's being made. You're telling other people how to do it. And so it's not so much from a level of seniority standpoint where if I'm a VP, I'm making decisions of consequence. It's more so like organization size and then just organizational culture. And so I feel like if you can put yourself in a position where the decisions you're making, you're personally responsible for the outcome and dealing with what comes from it, whether it's a positive decision or a negative decision,
Mm.
that's ultimately how you're forcing yourself to grow as a person.
Is that something that's always been important to you?
I think so. I think I wasn't aware of how important it was to me when I was younger, but have always gravitated towards leadership because I liked the responsibility of an outcome, which, pressure is a double-edged sword, where I constantly found myself gravitating towards opportunities or experiences where I was constantly under pressure. I would encourage anyone to do things that are hard. If there's two paths to get to the
That's
same
right.
point, take the harder path, and you'll learn a lot about yourself. But I think that as I've gotten older, I've realized that I seek out pressure because I want to have autonomy over living the whole experience. And I think when you are in a position where the decisions you're making force you to deal with the outcome, um, it sort of inherently or innately does that.
Well said.
Thanks.
That was so great. Do you, with the perspective that you have on what it's like to run Greener at the moment, relative to when you started the company, is entrepreneurship or has running the company been what you expected to any degree?
Not at all. And I think so in general, I would say startup and entrepreneurship is overglorified because a lot of times people focus on success stories and it's always the, 0 to 100 unicorn company or, Jeff Bezos or Elon, they were sleeping under a table, they were eating ramen for years and look at what they did. And, it's like, that's a great story now because they made it. But no one talks about how much suffering is involved to get to that point. And I think that was something that in general is something that you can't understand unless you go through it yourself. So I would say something that was a misconception to me was that when you're pursuing building a company, that's essentially you pursuing your dream in public, it requires an incredible level of vulnerability. Everything is personal. So this is much more about building yourself into the person that can run the company that you want to have than building the company itself. And so I think I didn't understand the level of emotional burn that was going to come with it. I also had no appreciation for how difficult things were going to be.
So, well, the thing that captured me was, and I'm afraid that's probably going to happen again, but it's okay. We'll roll with it.
Yeah.
So just the thing that that captured me was build yourself into the person that can run the company that you want.
Yeah.
That is a very powerful concept of entrepreneurship that I think more people need to talk about. So I guess my last question on this piece, which I'm glad that the lights gave me the opportunity to ask, is at what point did you have the vocabulary to describe that type of self growth?
I would say probably last year, middle of 2024, and it the whole journey has been introspective. So I would say like one of the hardest things about entrepreneurship is everything well, one, the material side of it is there's an unbelievably high amount of high frequency, high intensity bad news that like you just would never experience unless you're putting yourself in a position to be constantly told no, constantly discouraged. That's material. That's pretty easy to deal with. I would say the hardest part is the personal, mental, emotional, spiritual side of it where it's like, should it be me? Can I continue to believe in myself? I'm hearing no 100 times a day. How can I keep going? And like, you know, that piece of it, I feel like to build the mental fortitude to protect your unconditional belief in the company so that when you hear no, you feel like the other person's wrong, um, is a really interesting sort of journey. And so what I was going to say is from the beginning, you're introspective because you're forced to sort of just look at yourself in the mirror every day. That's all it really is. And like you have to be introspective about, am I capable of this? And like, can I execute? I'm responsible for other people. I'm solving an impossible problem. Um, Larger sort of philosophical questions, I feel like is the more difficult piece of it. So I've always been introspective about it. I would say that there was a point in time where we turned a corner as a company where I had for a year been pulling the idea out of my head, which is a process I love in general. It's super creative, but we were in like this, like we were talking about earlier, material generation phase where it was, we're building decks nonstop, we're building one pagers nonstop, we're building like the foundation of our story on paper, like digitally to promote to investors, to prospective customers, to partners. And once that chapter closed, it turned into selling the product and commercializing. And I would say at that time, because I had just gotten through what to me seems like the first cycle of ideation into something more tangible, I was able to look backwards and then realize like just how insane the entire journey was. And that's really when I feel like I was able to understand how personal the journey was. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, well, it does, and it's a good transition into what I was curious about because I really appreciate you indulging the questions. I mean, I love getting into the self growth stuff. We could do an entire episode just about that, and maybe we should. But for some context into what led you to this point to be able to discuss these things, the vehicle, which is greener. So at the beginning, you said there was a lot of work. Making decks and making a lot of content. So let's just start at the beginning. So what did greener look like when you started? When you just like how would you describe what the beginning was?
So the beginning for me was like this almost frantic and manic need to learn as much as I possibly could to become informed enough to actually pursue this dream in a way where I felt in control and confident about what I was talking about. And so the beginning was just nonstop research, trying to understand vocabulary words. What is a cap table? What's the difference between venture capital and private equity? Like things that, I'm using every day or that seem so trivial, but I just didn't know because I was so young. I was 20 years old. And so the beginning was just this obsessive learning and really just I keep saying pulling ideas out of my head. That's always been true for me, but like typing everything out, writing everything out that was in my head and then trying to put structure around the idea. And then when I got into the Fairfield Startup Program, that helped me, sort of have a format for how should I be thinking about this idea. And working backwards. So it was always, the intention is at a super high level, like just save the planet, right? What's my problem? I want to solve climate change. And then how am I going to do that working backwards? And then what's even more difficult is how am I going to be profitable doing that? And so that was sort of what the beginning looked like for me.
What was the value proposition? Like what was the company at that point?
It was something, the tech was the same, the idea and the market were completely different. So we were pitching keep in mind when ESG was a buzzword and decarb criteria for like portfolios was super important. We were providing a service to provide private equity firms with ESG data. On how their portfolio companies were performing against any sort of decarbonization criteria they had for their portfolio. So our target market was private investors. The platform is pretty much the same we wanted to be providing real-time data that couldn't be manipulated. And I'm sure the features and the functionality that we brainstormed were completely different. But that was at the time what we were pitching.
Well, and so this is the question that I had about the company today. But so if you're saying it's the same, I'll just ask you now. But at the time, if you are a company that has a layer that's trying to make sense of a lot of this data, where's the data coming from? Like, do you have to integrate into certain hardware data collection devices? Like, was that ever a thought that you would do that? Do you partner with particular, all those types of questions?
Yes. And I will say probably the best way I can clarify it is the mission behind the tech is the same in the sense that our core thesis was around transparency. The product itself probably looks very different than it did when we were pitching it in the earliest days. And so we do leverage integration. So we're software only, but we integrate with one hardware piece called a telematic device, which is a hardware component that exists inside of every vehicle when it's manufactured, or it can be installed after the fact. And we partner with the providers of those hardware devices. We connect through an API, and it allows us to pull real-time vehicle performance data. And then the secondary system, to your point about integrations, that we leverage is fuel cards. So credit cards that are used by drivers. Every time they purchase fuel, a range of transaction data points are collected. So very similar to when you and I swipe our credit card. You know, it's telling us what we purchased, where, how much we spent, same sort of thing. And so in trucking and logistics, those are the only two primary data sources that can be used for the type of reporting or calculations or analytics that we're providing.
Oh, okay. So what I wanted to ask, so you said you talked about the integration with the different hardware pieces. You explained how you guys are a software layer on top of the data collection.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question was for a little bit of context. So at what point did you transition from being this software layer for private investors into the trucking and logistics space? Because the two pieces of hardware that you just described were specific to the
Transportation.
yeah. And so
Yeah.
at what point did that transition happen?
So when that's a good question. I'll preface by saying when we were still targeting private investors, we were focused on those that invested heavily in transportation. So the idea of leveraging telematics systems or asset tracking systems, fleet management software was something that was still part of the genesis of the original idea. Had no idea what fuel cards were until we did a true pivot into trucking. We made the full transition. We did about 65, 80 customer discovery interviews with different PE firms. And that was a grind. That was
Over how long?
6 to 8 months.
Okay.
And we were trying to get
Wow.
feedback. So like our iterative process was I needed to learn the PE industry beyond just my experience working at Greenbacker by having these conversations, understanding, okay, if you have ESG criteria or you're taking sustainability as a factor of your investments and your monitoring of your portfolio, what does that look like? We have mock-ups of what the software is going to be. Can we do a click through and show you? Would this be useful to you? What type of data would you want to be seeing? Is what we've mocked up similar to how you would envision this? What type of integrated system should we be integrating with from like a private investor standpoint? Is the tech you use in-house? Is it outsourced? Those sorts of questions. And then ultimately those discovery interviews, I would say, snowballed into, would you pay for this? And the answer was no. Like maybe not outright. Several people were direct enough and honest enough to tell us that, but it was always, you know, like maybe if you could do this, if you could. And it was becoming more and more obvious to me that like selling this in a private market is extraordinarily difficult because they're unregulated. And so we needed to pivot into a market that was under pressure, that felt the pressure, you know, regulatory, and that was highly under-resourced. Private equity firms aren't under-resourced. Sure. And so the immediate pivot was to supply chain. And then, okay, that sounds focused. It's not. What transportation mode within the supply chain is under the most amount of pressure? Who's responsible for the most amount of emissions? What's the legacy industry? And it was trucking.
So then who, this was, you said it was 6 to 8 months that you were doing these interviews. So was it 12 months in total after you had launched, you know, like whatever you would describe as the beginning? Was it about 12 months that you arrived at this point and you said we need to?
It was probably 12 to 14 months from the very genesis of the idea.
Okay.
So
So then how far after, like, hey, I'm deciding to do this?
I would say probably 14, 16
Oh,
months.
gotcha. Okay,
So
okay.
I went through the program at Fairfield pitching this idea that we're talking about. And then about halfway through, or I should say a few months after finishing the program was when it was that uncomfortable, like, wow, this thing I fell in love with is not going to work.
Yeah.
So that's the timeline.
Okay, so follow-up question, but what well, asked before that is, so you made this transition into the transportation industry. What was your experience there, and how did it turn into a company that you ended up like an industry you ended up building a company inside of?
I'll say that on a personal level, the pivot was the one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever gone through in my entire life. Cause I really like when you're ideating, you're dreaming without consequence, and everything that I had spent the past year and a half on learning and like immersing myself into the entire network I built was in private equity. So like the idea of divorcing that and having to make that pivot like in less than a week, really just to keep the company alive and keep going, keep the momentum going was like a really difficult decision that required me again to lean into uncertainty. And so um it was, I would say, I don't want to say starting from scratch, but from like a knowledge-based perspective, I knew a little bit about private equity because I worked at Greenbacker and because like my network was there was family, there was friends, there was like other mentors that worked as private investors.
Sure.
I knew nothing about trucking. And so building that knowledge base from scratch was like again the start of an obsessive process. What's the difference between full truckload, less than truckload? I had no idea what a for hire versus private fleet was. What's a dedicated operation? What's a third party logistics company? And like really learning the ecosystem and then trying to force myself to have conversations with professionals. This time, not even from a customer discovery standpoint, but like to understand like what does the day to day conversation sound like. And so that was much more difficult than understanding the private equity industry.
How long ago was that?
Um,
That
the
pivot, the decision.
mid 2023.
Okay, so it 2-ish years.
Yeah.
So how is, can you just describe the process of starting, like you said, effectively from scratch to, hitting, whatever substantial milestones, however you would define milestones, but just the process of going from scratch to then this milestone, if you could just.
Yeah. So there was a concentrated 2 months of like, I'm going to spend every waking moment understanding at a minimum, like just how this industry works. How does freight get from point A to point B? Like I really didn't know anything. And I was constantly making ecosystem diagrams. So like, okay, I can think of the market, and this is like pre-AI, which I'm actually really grateful for. So like, I was reading full articles like nonstop, and I was retaining it because I was writing it down by hand and like constantly making these ecosystem diagrams of okay, generally speaking, the market could be broken up into for hire and private fleets. And I remember that was like a massive sort of point of retention for me. And then like essentially just 2 months of really researching the vocabulary, the ins and outs, and then trying to figure out who I could talk to. And one of my very good guy friends from Fairfield, his dad owns a trucking company. His name is John Skirbo. He is the president of Daybreak Express. And hey, you should talk to my dad. And that one conversation actually ended up being, I would say, the most critical milestone that we've had as a company because they ended up being our first beta test pilot
Wow.
and customer. And so, like, he basically chose to believe in what we were building before we had built anything.
So his name is John.
His name's John.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, he's a champion. And so like that sort of him betting on us let us get started. And then a similar sort of thing that was ironic, and it was so difficult for me to have to even get on someone's calendar because like I would say trucking in general is a very close knit community where they are skeptical of people that aren't from the industry. Same thing. I had a guy friend from Fairfield whose dad was the president of operations for UPS in New York. And he would sit with me every week for 6 weeks and just teach me about the industry. Leo Cummings, amazing,
Wow.
amazing person. And so those were pivotal. And then they opened doors for me to have those same sort of conversations.
So then using those two huge pieces of momentum, how is it that you started to like, at what point is it that, so how many people also at the time? Is it just you or do you have a team?
A team of 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then how are you like at what point does funding come into the conversation? Like at what point does going to market, with this idea, how did you at that time, again, around a year ago, like address going to market?
So we did a friends and family round first. That initial bit of capital was, I'll take one step back. The most difficult phase for us was moving from ideation to MVP. So we couldn't raise money because we didn't have an MVP.
With this trucking
With this trucking idea.
angle. Okay.
Yes. And then we couldn't build an MVP because we didn't have money. So there is someone that I was very good friends with who is a part of the team but wasn't at the time, that we promised stock to in exchange for him to build the MVP that would enable us to raise money to pay him the rest of what he deserved for the time that he spent building the MVP. And he built the MVP for us. We raised capital from our friends and family, and then it let me hire our first engineer. And so that was like sort of the genesis of building a team and
Wow.
getting to market. And then continue to raise money because in parallel with the MVP being made, I met John. John promised to beta test it with Daybreak. So now we had a pilot customer, and that's like a great milestone to go raise. Yeah, exactly. And so you're like constantly trying to stack these micro wins. And then, we have $500,000 in capital, and now NFI, one of the largest for-hire fleets in North America, is piloting with us, and so is DB Schenker.
But you acquired those. So the funding came from a lot of pitching, or it also came through a network.
An unbelievable amount of pitching.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then once that happened, then what was it? How did you acquire these larger scale pilot or customers? Was it through your network, or was it through just, I don't know, some other type of marketing sales, some other lever?
So I was grinding industry events. I was going to everything I could in person, PMTA events, New Jersey Motor Truck Association events, and I spoke at a New Jersey Motor Truck Association event, keynoted it more so from an educational perspective, and this is the problem we know that exists in the industry. Raise your hand if you're feeling this. And it was, I was always mindful not to sound condescending. There should never be fear involved in the conversation. Like, hey, this is coming, and like, you better have the ability to report. It was always like, we're here, we're in your corner, we're trying to take this off your plate. And through those industry events, was able to meet the right people where it still is a new problem to the industry. It resonated, and hey, let's have a conversation. And we're looking for a design partner. We're looking for a collaborator. Would you be willing to pilot this and give feedback? And that's sort of how we got started. Yeah.
So then through all of that, how, like, where are you at this point? Given so you raised that round of funding, I mean, I assume, grew a team, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And then you started these pilot programs and you started gaining this momentum, where does it bring you to today?
And so now we're commercial. The team is 10 people. We've raised a little over $1 million in funding. We have amazing partnerships, which was part of what the focus was on in 2024, building channel partnerships, because we're a bootstrap team. We didn't have the sales infrastructure to sell direct to all the fleets that we wanted to without a reference account. So building partnerships with Geotab, with Isaac, with OmniTrax, WEX, EFS, Spark 360, the consulting firms that were going to be advising the
I was
public
thinking the
fleets.
same thing. I was thinking all of those companies as you were saying it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like really we were trying to build an ecosystem-led go-to-market strategy, and now we have it. But that was not something that I understood until firsthand experiencing that direct sales was not our best path forward.
I just like, I'm almost like shaking how many questions I have, but the one that I've been holding on to the whole time, because I think the way that you've laid out the trajectory of the company, where you have this period of time, 14 to 16 months of validating, or trying to validate the first version of what this idea was. And then you pivot into this the second place where you have a direction that you think you want to go in, and then you start gaining momentum, like you said, very small wins, but this unbelievable amount of work that goes into it. However, the interesting thing that I see in these two halves of the story is that there's just as much, if not more, work, because there's more at stake with this new direction, the one that you've gained traction in. At first, the first 14 to 16 months, what led you to not stop?
like there's a lot of anxiety involved from pressure. And so like um it was this constant anxiety of feeling like we were behind, where when I set out to build the company, we've hit milestones that I never even dreamed that we would hit. But like I think every founder is guilty of like constantly feeling like you're up against the clock. And like when you take money from outside investors, there's always that third layer of pressure too. And then when you take money from friends and family, it's sort of the same thing. And so I would say it was always unconditional belief that let you keep going, or that let me keep going, adrenaline to make this what I know it could be and what I believe it could be, and then anxiety of we're up against the clock, and this is the time to really double down and just get it done, whatever it takes.
But like for example, like in that first 14 to 16 months, there's no evidence that's reflected at you that says that what you're doing is working. So that's why it's still, it's not easy. It is extremely hard to continue working, from the position that you're in. But I just think it's a fascinating period of life, and it's fascinating when people make the consistent decision to do so, like you did, when you are just continually pushing in a certain direction when you don't have um, when you really don't have a lot of evidence at your disposal.
Well, that to your point, and I don't know how much we even need to talk about this, but I would say there's two types of burnout. And like the physical burnout is really easily understood because you're overworking, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, and like your body just sort of breaks down. But what you just described of putting 200% of yourself into something and there being a lack of momentum, like when you wake up every day
Mm-hmm.
and put in 16 hours and the needle doesn't seem like it's moving, that's like type 2 burnout. And like I would say a lot of founders are oblivious that like that can happen. And like that to be able to overcome, or to be able to continue to work hard without seeing the needle move, trusting that, your consistency will stack on top of each other and like good opportunities will come, is again like uncertainty. You're just betting on yourself.
So, in and along the same lines of, what makes this journey challenging for someone like you, I have a few mentors that are very close to me. You know who you are, and they're all women, and they talk about their experience being women in deep tech environments and
Mm.
funding environments. And so, what has your experience been being a woman, not only in the typical like male dominated funding spaces or male dominated entrepreneurship spaces, but also without further context, like trucking to me seems like a very male dominated space.
hmm
And so, in any of these areas, what's your experience been?
I would say it's similar. My answer would be similar for both, in the sense that I think establishing credibility takes twice as long. And I have never, very few times in my life have I felt outright like, someone's being condescending to me because I'm a woman, or, uh, they're being rude or dismissive. It's never been that. I feel like maybe I can see when it's taken longer for someone to take me seriously, especially in the beginning, because I was straight out of college, raising millions of dollars, and I don't have experience. I'm a woman. I'm a young person too. And so I feel like for investors, it took for me to really become an expert in what I'm talking about. And that's true of trucking too. So like one of my most favorite, like I love being not just in a thoughtful conversation, but I felt like when we were fundraising, Q&A was really where I could shine, because it's like, anyone can pitch a good idea and anyone can do it 10 out of 10 with enough practice, but like, do you really know what you're talking about, and are you capable of executing? And I felt like I was able to gain credibility in investor and fundraising spaces and circles through demonstrating domain expertise, which came from like just years of nerding out and obsessing and researching over
Right.
what I'm building. And then in trucking, they are, I mean, I just adore the industry. Their legacy, they have old-fashioned attitudes, which have been difficult to overcome from a sales perspective. but I've never felt rejected by the industry. They're actually very welcoming. And I think it's the same sort of thing. Like, does this girl know what she's talking about when she's coming in here? And just being super mindful that like sustainability has been a wound for the industry when policy swings back and forth. And like, I'm never trying to come at it from a you need to do this, let's save the world, even though maybe that's my own internal motivation. But to just talk about it practically. And I think practicality, and like talking about it with a voice of reason to both trucking and investors is a way to sort of overcome any attitudes.
Well, I have three more questions, and some of my favorite questions ever. And the first one that I really wish we left more time for, but answer to whatever capacity you want to, is whether it's focused on women founders or just founders in general. Based on your experience so far and what you've learned, what would you tell somebody that is just starting out? You 3 years ago.
Oh my gosh, I think I could take like a year to answer the question.
Oh, we should just do another episode on that. But just choose, I guess, the two things that come to mind.
I would say if you're starting a company to make money versus starting a company to solve a problem that you feel personally passionate about, if you're building the company just to make money, you will not have the grit to get through some of the hardest times that you're going to go through, like on the journey of building a company. So like, I think something that has saved me when things get really challenging is like I am able to zoom out and say like, yes, I'm building this company because I want to make 100x on a return when I exit, or because I want to build this integrated system. I want to digitalize trucking. I want to help automate in a legacy industry, an old school industry. But like when you're hearing no every single day for weeks and weeks at a time, it's like, okay, well, why am I still doing this? And it's because I want to have a positive impact on the planet. And if you don't sort of have that root motivation or that root inspiration, I think getting through those valleys is almost impossible. I would say pick a problem that feels impossible to solve that's 10 times bigger than you, because you will never run out of ways to continue to innovate and ways to continue to solve the problem. When GreenIRR is successful and we exit, the problem I'm still trying to solve is climate change. I'm going to go find another way to do that. And it's, maybe not in supply chain, or maybe it is, but I would say pick up a problem that's bigger than you. And then really, I would say the biggest lesson that I've learned is uncertainty, and like, don't let fear of uncertainty stop you. If you can practice letting go of how you're going to get to where you want to be, and like you're always going to be surprised by what comes from that journey, like that is something that you should practice almost like a religion.
Well said. At this moment in time, what is the largest hurdle that you're navigating with GreenIRR, and how is it also an opportunity?
I would say the biggest hurdle that we're facing and have been facing is just the legacy nature of the industry.
Okay.
So it's not like we're selling a new tire or a new part. Sustainability and software is something that's not a line item in the budget. And at the same time, automating a legacy industry, not just to help them solve a pain point, but to make them more efficient, is probably one of the largest opportunities that I can think of. And trucking's a massive industry. And so for me, I think proving that sustainability is the same thing as efficiency, and efficiency is the same thing as profitability, and really trying to be a thought leader in that narrative versus like sustainability means like, salt of the earth, like, let's save the world. And like, sometimes fleet managers don't want to have that conversation, if at all, which totally makes sense. But it's like, if we can help you reduce your fuel consumption by providing you the analytics to make more informed operational decisions, and you're saving 5% of your fuel every year, like you're actually more sustainable and you're more profitable. And so I think transitioning those legacy attitudes by bringing the proper tech at the same time is a challenge and an opportunity.
So with this challenge and opportunity in front of you, you have spoken to it in different ways throughout this conversation, but how would you answer the question? What inspires you?
Oh, that's a good one. Um, a lot of things. I think this is not a perfect answer, but I would say the what inspires me is sort of back to the problem. What gets me mad is when I think about our relationship to our planet and like just feeling this, it never goes away, this like burning desire to do something about it. And so that I think is inspiring, being in communities like Greentown Labs or New Lab or, just being around other climate tech, clean tech founders where we're solving the same problem on the same mission in a million different ways and seeing them do it. And it's like, this is the real deal. This is not any sort of fluffy tech or like, this vibe coded startup. No offense to anyone that vibe codes, but like, this is the real deal. And this is like disruptive and transformative, and seeing them do it is ultra inspiring. And then I would say back to my team, like, um, maybe I was the genesis of the idea, but that's almost the easiest part, executing 10,000 times harder, and they execute every day and they double down every day and they go through the bad news and the peaks and valleys with me, and like seeing them stay so committed is like just unbelievable. And I feel lucky to have people on my team that believe in this dream just as much as I do.
So, if anyone else was inspired to follow along with your journey or Greener's journey, what's the best way to do that?
Probably go to our website, or LinkedIn. I would say follow us on LinkedIn. You can always see updates. And then if you want to reach out directly to me, you can always reach out to me through Greener's website.
Perfect. Celine, thank you so much. I'm excited to stay in touch. I'm excited to see where you are in a couple months from now, but thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.